Hello everyone and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. It happened at the end of October 2022, on a Monday night that slipped quietly into the early hours of Tuesday. I live with my wife Erica and our 2 children on a 3-acre property on the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, near Old Gallatin Road, which winds between wheat fields and low hills. Our nearest neighbor is Mr. Randall Huxley, a reserved man who lives in a weather-worn ranch house about 200 meters west of our property. His land borders a stretch of pine forest that extends toward the Bridger Mountains. In 5 years, I had seen him maybe 6 times. Once at Lowe's in town, twice at the Big Sky post office picking up packages, and a couple more times when he lifted a hand from his truck as he drove past our gate. He never received visitors, never joined neighborhood cookouts, and never put up Christmas decorations. That particular night, Erica and I stayed up late because our son Noah, 14, was finishing a science project about the geysers of Yellowstone and needed my laptop. By the time we printed his report, it was already 2:45 in the morning. I shut down the computer, locked the sliding door, and went to the kitchen sink for a glass of water. That's when I noticed through the window a faint orange glow pulsing above the tree line on Huxley's side. It seemed too bright to be a porch light. I called Erica, and we both squinted into the darkness until our eyes adjusted. It wasn't a lamp, but a steady flame burning behind his shed, illuminating thin ribbons of smoke that rose straight up. The air was perfectly still. We opened the window, and within seconds, a thick, sour smell, like burning plastic, filled the kitchen. "Who burns trash at 3 in the morning?" Erica said, almost rhetorically, but the question lingered in the air. Our first concern was wildfire risk. The Bridgers had suffered severe fires 2 summers before, and everyone in the area had learned to be extremely cautious. I grabbed a flashlight, thinking of driving over to his driveway to make sure everything was under control. Erica stayed at the window with her phone in hand, ready to call 911 if sparks reached the dry grass. But I never made it to the truck. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, a sharp crack tore through the night, like a log splitting suddenly. The flame behind the shed flared higher, then dimmed. I turned off the flashlight to avoid being seen and stood still, listening. Another cracking sound followed, slower this time, as if something heavy was breaking. Then silence, except for the faint hiss of fire. I backed up, locked the door, and told Erica, "He's doing something out there and I don't like it." We decided not to call the fire department because the wind was calm. Instead, we watched until the glow faded around 3:20 a.m. The smoke thinned into a faint gray ribbon, barely visible against the winter stars. We slept a few uneasy hours before the alarm rang at 6. Noah caught the bus at 6:45, and I drove our 10-year-old daughter, Leia, to Morning Star School. On the way back, curiosity got the better of me. I turned down Huxley's gravel driveway. His truck was gone. He must have left before dawn. Behind the shed stood a blackened metal barrel, still hot enough to shimmer the air above it. On its rim clung charred remains, melted plastic, something fibrous like fabric, and warped sheets of aluminum. About 6 feet from the barrel, a patch of ground appeared scorched and bare, as if whatever had been dumped there had burned through the frost-hardened soil, leaving a dark stain. Leaning against a tree, blade buried in the ground, was a flat-point shovel. I picked it up by the handle, covered in ash, and was startled by the warmth it still held. It hadn't cooled overnight. I pictured Huxley alone in his yard, feeding the barrel, then emptying it onto the ground in the hours when no one should be awake. The image unsettled me. I set the shovel back exactly as I'd found it and drove home. Erica was waiting on the porch. She told me she'd seen tire tracks pressed into the grass, cutting toward the woods, deep ruts curving north toward an old service road. We agreed not to mention any of this to the kids. For the next 2 weeks, life returned to normal. Dropping the kids at school, my shifts at the hardware store, Erica's accounting work, and the weekend soccer games. If Huxley burned anything again, we didn't notice. His light still came on at dusk and off at dawn, same as always. The mailman raised the flag on his mailbox every Friday. Even so, each night before bed, my eyes drifted toward his property, half expecting that orange glow to return. On November 12th, a Saturday, our town's Facebook group filled with posts about a missing hiker, a 30-year-old man named Daniel Price. He'd gone hiking on the Truman Trail, less than 4 miles from our street. He left his Subaru at the trailhead Tuesday morning and never returned to his motel in Bozeman. The Gallatin County Search and Rescue Team spent Wednesday and Thursday combing the hills but found nothing. Someone shared a photo from his Instagram, a smiling man in a green jacket holding a map. The Bridger peaks behind him. The caption read, "Solo week in Big Sky Country. See you on the other side." The timing bothered me. That Tuesday was exactly 1 week after Huxley's midnight bonfire. At first, I tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Montana draws hikers from everywhere, and late autumn accidents aren't rare. But the closeness of the trailhead to our neighborhood unsettled me. I pulled out a county map and drew a straight line from the trail's northern loop to our street. I realized the path crossed through private logging land, less than a mile from Huxley's back fence. When I showed Erica the map, she stared at it quietly, her finger resting over the pine-covered area. "Do you think he—" She started but didn't finish. That same afternoon, I walked to the edge of our property, where the grass met Huxley's woods. A thin layer of frost covered fallen pine needles, and the air smelled faintly of coming snow. I found the tire tracks Erica had mentioned. 2 parallel grooves hardened into the earth like stone. They disappeared into the trees toward a rocky slope. I thought about following them, but stopped when I saw new padlocks on Huxley's gate. The next morning, Sunday, we attended church in Bozeman. When we came back, 2 sheriff's trucks were parked in front of Huxley's house. A couple of officers in reflective jackets were talking to him on the porch. A black Labrador wearing a search vest was sniffing around the foundation. Erica stopped our truck halfway up the driveway, engine off. We watched through the windshield. Huxley kept wiping his hands on his pants. One of the officers pointed toward the forest while another took notes. 10 minutes later, they left without arresting him. Huxley went inside and slammed the door. That night, heavy snow began to fall. Thick flakes buried the last signs of autumn. Around 11 p.m., the power flickered and went out. Not unusual during the first snowstorms here. We lit the fireplace, wrapped ourselves in blankets in the living room, and placed battery lanterns on the coffee table. The house went quiet except for the wind rattling the gutters. The blackout lasted nearly 2 hours. When the lights finally came back on, the first thing I did was peek through the blinds toward Huxley's property. My chest tightened. A flashlight beam moved slowly in circles behind his shed. Every few seconds it stopped and pointed downward, illuminating patches on the snow. At that exact moment, I heard crunching footsteps on our driveway. I touched Erica's shoulder, and we both turned toward the side window. It was one of the deputies, the tall one who had questioned Huxley earlier. He was approaching with a flashlight. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the fresh snow. "Sorry for the late hour," he said. "Would you mind if I asked whether your security cameras caught anything unusual last Tuesday night?" I told him we didn't have cameras, only motion lights. Curiosity slipped into my voice. "Is this about the missing hiker?" The officer sighed. Snow was collecting on his shoulders. "We're following every lead." Mr. Huxley reported hearing a vehicle on his driveway that night. That puzzled me. Erica and I had seen those same tire marks. Why was Huxley only mentioning it now? The deputy took my number, thanked me, and returned to his patrol car. The next day, schools were closed because of the snow, though I still had to work. I drove past Huxley's house at 8 in the morning. His driveway was cleared, freshly plowed, but there were no tire tracks leading to the main road. Either he hadn't gone out, or he'd spent the early hours shoveling. The thought of him awake and active while everyone else slept made the back of my neck tighten. That afternoon, with the kids restless at home, we decided to go sledding. The best hill was on the empty lot next to Huxley's woods. Noah hauled the sleds uphill while I watched from below. On my third climb, I noticed a spot where the snow seemed thinner, a shallow depression near a cluster of birch trees. The kids zoomed past laughing, so I marked the place with my boot but said nothing. That night, curiosity got the best of me. I told Erica I was going out for firewood, grabbed a shovel, and walked toward the birches under the light of a full moon that painted the snow a ghostly blue. The temperature had dropped, yet the depression was still softer than the rest of the ground. I scraped away 6 inches of snow until the metal edge of the shovel struck something solid. I knelt and brushed aside more snow, revealing a gray trash bag half buried in the soil. Even in the cold, a sour stench escaped. My stomach turned. I tore a corner open. Inside was a tarp, muddy and tightly rolled. I prodded it with the shovel, and the damp fabric gave way, revealing something pale. I stumbled back, chest tight. I didn't dig further. I covered the bag again with snow, hurried back to the house, and called the sheriff's office. The dispatcher's voice was calm. "Stay inside your residence. A team is on the way." They arrived with floodlights, yellow tape, and a coroner's van. The officers followed my footprints to the birches, marked the area, and began to dig. I wrapped Erica and the kids in blankets, keeping them inside, though they pressed their faces to the window trying to see what was happening. Past midnight, an officer knocked on our door. He thanked me for calling and said they'd found items of interest. He couldn't share details, but assured me they now had a full search warrant for Huxley's property. We didn't sleep a minute that night. Blue police lights cut through our blinds until dawn as detectives gathered evidence on both properties. At 6 a.m., a tow truck hauled away Huxley's pickup. An hour later, they let him out in handcuffs, flanked by deputies. Snow kept falling, soft, relentless, muffling every sound. Over the following week, the news began to fill in the gaps. The sheriff's office confirmed that the human remains found under the tarp belonged to Daniel Price. The cause of death would take time to determine, but detectives believed Price had crossed paths with Huxley on the trail. Phone records placed Huxley near the Truman Trail trailhead that Tuesday morning. A store clerk also remembered him buying bleach and heavy-duty trash bags at Ace Hardware later that day. Inside his shed, investigators found charred fragments of nylon backpack straps, a partially melted GPS device, and Price's driver's license fused into a block of plastic. A few feet away, they uncovered a shallow pit where Huxley had tried to bury more evidence before the ground froze. Those fires we'd seen had been his first attempt to destroy it all. When that failed, he hid it beneath the snow. For days afterward, every time I stepped outside, it felt like the smell of burnt plastic returned, drifting through the icy air like a ghost. Noah asked if we were going to move. Laya started having nightmares about fires behind sheds. Erica blamed herself for not calling the authorities that first night. I kept telling her none of us could have guessed the truth, though even I wasn't convinced. November turned into December. Huxley remained in the county jail awaiting trial. Reporters tried to interview the neighbors, but we stayed silent. I began double-checking the locks before bed and scanning the tree line for any flicker or movement. Snow covered the birch clearing, but no blanket of white could erase the dark stain in my mind where curiosity had uncovered horror. On Christmas Eve, we received one final piece of information. Detectives had found pages from a journal in Huxley's basement, disjointed notes about purifying the trail and erasing the wanderers. They didn't know if there were more victims, but they reopened 2 missing person cases from 2020. Search dogs would return in spring once the thaw softened the ground. Sometimes I drive past the edge of the woods and imagine hikers wandering off the trail, trusting the calm and beauty of Montana, unaware that a solitary neighbor watched those groves from the dark. Our valley looks the same as ever. White peaks, blue sky, and a line of pines guarding every property. But whenever a cold wind carries the faintest smell of smoke, my mind returns to that kitchen window, staring into the blackness, wondering what still burns beyond what the eyes can see. Before we dive into the next story, if it's your first time on our channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming horror tales. Your support means the world to us, so share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. Story 2. I moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico at the end of 2012, right before Thanksgiving. My new house was on a quiet street near Lomas Boulevard, one of those older roads where each yard told a different story of desert landscaping, some with rocks and yuccas, others with small patches of grass struggling to stay green under the desert's blazing sun. I liked the neighborhood from day one. It had a lived-in yet serene feel, with those wide-open skies overhead and the Sandia Mountains glowing pink at sunset. I worked remotely for a software company, so I spent most of my time at home on irregular hours, going out only to stretch or take out the trash. The first strange thing happened on the night of December 8th, 2012, a Thursday, a little before midnight. I remember the time because my computer read 11:46 p.m. when I decided to empty the kitchen bin before bed. The street was silent save for distant traffic from the highway. As soon as I stepped onto my driveway, the porch's motion light flicked on behind me. Across the sidewalk next to a leaning mailbox, a man was standing motionless. He was facing my direction, feet shoulder-width apart, hands hanging loose at his sides under the yellowish street lamp. His face was in shadow, but I felt his eyes fixed on me. I stopped for a moment. He didn't greet me or make any gesture. It felt rude to keep staring, so I continued to the curbside bin, lifted the lid, and tossed the bag. When I looked up again, he was still there, stiff as a statue. I offered a timid good evening with a nod, but he said nothing. The silence grew so heavy that I went back inside, double-locked the door, and tried to convince myself it had only been something odd but harmless. Maybe he was waiting for a loose dog, or maybe he was lost in thought. The next day, I brought a plate of cookies to my neighbor on the left, Mrs. Garcia, a retired teacher who watered her cacti every morning. I asked if she knew the man across the street. She smiled and said, "Oh, that's Mr. Reyes. Quiet guy, keeps to himself, that's all." That reassured me a bit. I figured he was just shy. 7 days later, on December 15th, the scene repeated almost exactly. This time it was 1:10 a.m. The cold air smelled of juniper smoke from some fireplace. The moment I set foot on the concrete, there he was again. Same place, same stance. His expressionless face aimed at me. The street lamp buzzed above his head. A moth fluttered between us, its wings glinting. I felt the blood rush to my ears and the world shrink to that motionless figure. I hurried back inside, heart pounding, and watched him through the blinds. He stood there a full minute without moving, then turned and walked toward his house until he vanished into the dark. As the weeks passed, I began to notice a pattern. The man, always dressed in a faded gray hoodie and loose jeans, appeared only when I took the trash out after 11 p.m. If I went earlier, nothing. But if I waited until late, he would emerge as if he had an internal clock. Once, just before Christmas, I picked up my phone to record him. The screen lit my face, and at that exact instant, he slipped behind a huge cottonwood tree, never taking his eyes off me. The video showed only an empty yard. I felt childish, filming a neighbor for simply standing outside, though something about his stillness was deeply unsettling. January 2013 brought even colder nights. On the 4th, the frigid wind rattled the metal gate along the side of my house. I almost didn't take out the trash, but habit won out. I went out with my breath fogging the air. On the other side of Lomas Boulevard, Mr. Reyes was there again, this time closer, right at the edge of the sidewalk. A car passed and its headlights lit his face, sunken cheeks and eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I froze. The plastic bag crackled in my hands like thunder in the silence. He didn't blink. I backed along the driveway, still holding the trash, slipped inside and locked the door quickly, my heart thudding in my chest. Sleep began to slip away. I dreamed I was standing under that street lamp, my feet set in dry cement, unable to move, while a silhouette approached slowly. During the day, everything seemed normal. I saw him once at noon watering a pot of chilies on his porch. He greeted me with a small gesture. I almost convinced myself that his late-night appearances were misunderstandings amplified by the darkness. But each night told a different story. In January, I decided to break the pattern. I waited until 2 a.m., and instead of just taking the bag, I dragged the entire bin to the curb. The noise of the wheels over the icy pebbles forced me to walk upright, trying to project confidence. The street was empty. I felt relief, thinking maybe I'd imagined it all. I lingered a moment, pretending to admire the moon ringed by halos. Then I heard a creak behind me. Mr. Reyes' screen door opening slowly. He came out with the hood up, barefoot on the frosted grass, and positioned himself exactly beneath the street lamp. My bones felt heavy. I mustered an effort and murmured, "Good evening." Silence was his only reply. I went back inside with my skin crawling. February brought longer afternoons and a bit of warmth. I started jogging after work to clear my head. One Saturday, I crossed paths with Mr. Reyes in broad daylight on Monroe Street. We were walking in opposite directions. He carried a plastic bag in his hand and kept his head down. As we passed, I said, "Hello." He mumbled something like "sorry" or "forgive me" without meeting my eyes. His voice sounded small, shaky, almost frightened. For the first time, I felt a surge of compassion. Maybe he suffered from social anxiety or some other difficulty hidden behind those nocturnal stares. Even so, the early morning appearances continued, always silent, always motionless. My nerves stretched like taut strings. I started texting my friend Mark in Colorado every time it happened. I sent time-stamped notes as if they were evidence. "He's out there again." 12:14 a.m. He joked that I should buy a guard dog, but his jokes didn't dispel my unease. The episode most seared into my memory happened in February 2013, a moonless Thursday night with the thermometer barely above zero. I had stayed up late cleaning up code. At 10:05 p.m., I gathered 2 trash bags. Before going out, I peeked through the blinds. The street looked empty. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The porch light illuminated the driveway. I walked to the bin, lifted the lid, and dropped the bags, the thud echoing against the plastic. When I turned around, my breath caught. Mr. Reyes was no longer across from his house. He was in my yard, less than 30 feet away, standing on the decorative gravel by my mailbox. He had crossed over without a sound while I was looking at the bin. He remained motionless, saying nothing. I stared, unable to make a sound. Then he took a step forward, the pebbles crunching under his foot. Another step. His shoulders hunched, his hands hidden in the hoodie's front pocket. I backed up to the porch, fumbled with my keys, and slipped inside, locking both deadbolts with trembling fingers. Through the peephole, I watched him slowly return to his side of the street, merging with the shadow like a specter. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch with the phone ready to dial 911. At 2:30 a.m., a soft thump startled me. It turned out to be just a branch brushing the roof. That's when I realized I couldn't keep living with this fear. The next morning, I left a note with the neighborhood association, careful but direct, asking if anyone else had noticed strange behavior late at night. 2 replies came in. A college student named Jasmine said she had seen Mr. Reyes standing in her driveway at midnight on February 10th, staring at her door. Another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, 2 houses down, wrote that he often sat on his porch at night and had seen him wandering the street looking lost. March began with strong winds, dust devils swirling in the vacant lots. The tension felt like a spring about to snap. I installed motion sensor floodlights along the side passage and started carrying pepper spray whenever I went out after dark. But caution didn't erase the background fear. On March 12th at 11:50 p.m., the floodlights came on. I ran to the window and saw him halfway up my driveway, staring directly into the porch camera. He didn't come any closer. He just turned slowly and went back to his yard. I knew something was about to break. The next night at 1:32 a.m., the desert was still. No wind, no distant sirens. I delayed taking out the trash, hoping my neighbor would already be asleep. The security lights revealed only my empty yard. I walked to the bin, lifted the lid, and then came a metallic snap, the unmistakable sound of a knife being flipped open. It came from the darkness across the street. Mr. Reyes emerged from between 2 parked cars, hoodie unzipped. In the moonlight, a long kitchen knife gleamed in his right hand. Without a word, he ran toward me, his footsteps booming on the asphalt. Terror fogged my mind, as if gravity had let go. I backed up, fumbling for the pepper spray, but there wasn't enough time. Suddenly, a blur shot in from my right. Mr. Thompson, the neighbor 2 houses down, charged off his porch and slammed into Reyes, shoulder to chest. They both hit the pavement, and the knife skittered into the gutter. Thompson pinned him, shouting for someone to call the police. I ran inside for the phone, palms slick with sweat, and dialed 911 with a trembling voice. When I returned, Thompson still had him face down, speaking to him in a low, firm voice. One by one, porch lights flicked on, a silent chain of concern. Albuquerque police arrived within minutes. Red and blue lights painted the stucco walls. Officers cuffed Mr. Reyes without difficulty. He didn't resist. He only trembled and murmured phrases I couldn't make out. The knife lay in the gutter, dusty but otherwise untouched. Panting, Thompson told the officers he'd been watching him for weeks, and when he saw the charge, knew he had to act. He had a superficial cut on his forearm, probably from the fall onto the pavement. Paramedics cleaned and bandaged it on the sidewalk. An officer took my statement in the living room, notebook balanced on one knee. I recounted the months of silent appearances, the sudden advance, the scuffle. He listened carefully and then said quietly, "Some neighbors mentioned Mr. Reyes had gone off his medication. His family's been trying to locate him." Those words chilled me. Fear shifted into a kind of sadness. Untreated mental illness had turned into something dangerous for everyone. 3 days later, I received a follow-up call. The detective told me Reyes had been admitted to the University of New Mexico Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. No charges would be filed for now. Doctors needed to assess his condition. In the meantime, a relative would take care of his house. Thompson's quick action had likely saved my life. And his. Everything felt different in the neighborhood afterward. Quieter, yes, but also heavier with what had almost happened. I put up more floodlights, upgraded the porch camera, and started having coffee now and then with Thompson on his terrace. He confessed he had barely slept those weeks, too worried by what he saw every night. Jasmine began walking her dog earlier, avoiding the dark. Mrs. Garcia organized a small neighborhood watch. We exchanged numbers and promised to look out for one another. One mild April evening, with the sandiest turning watermelon pink, I took out the trash at dusk. For the first time in months, no figure awaited across the street. Even so, I still felt his presence in my memory. That rigid posture, that silent gaze. Some nights I woke at 2 a.m. expecting to hear a knock at the door, but the street remained calm. Weeks turned into summer. In June, heat settled over Albuquerque like a suffocating blanket. I learned that Mr. Reyes had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. With medication and therapy, he was improving, and his family planned to move him near relatives in Santa Fe. Knowing that eased some of the tension, though it didn't erase those winter months entirely. The mind keeps images etched by fear. I often relive the critical instant, the flash of the knife, the thunder of footsteps, the pure courage of a neighbor throwing himself into danger. It reminds me that real horror doesn't need ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's a silent man standing in a yard at 3 a.m., a fragile mind spilling into violence for lack of care. And other times, salvation comes from an ordinary person, a neighbor who decides to act when the seconds matter more than anything. Story 3. In 2016, I moved to Boise, Idaho, because a logistics company on Capitol Boulevard offered me a job I couldn't refuse. I had lived my whole life in Missoula, Montana, and was looking for a fresh start in a place that still felt like the Mountain West. Boise struck me as friendly and manageable, a real urban center, but also wide residential streets flanked by old shade trees. The duplex I found was on South Owyhee Street, on the Bench, about a 10-minute drive from the Boise River Greenbelt. It was a low brick building from the early 1980s. Unit A, mine, occupied the left side. Unit B was on the right. Both shared a thin interior wall, a crawlspace-style attic, and a single unfinished basement divided only by plywood panels and 2x4 studs. The landlady, Mrs. Horton from Meridian, warned me that sound traveled through the floorboards. I might hear my neighbor's washer at night, though she swore the neighborhood stayed quiet after dark. I signed a 6-month lease for $895 a month, a steal in a city growing at full speed. The first week passed in peace. In the evenings, I explored Vista Avenue, grabbed coffee at Flying M, and bought groceries at the Albertsons on Overland Road. My neighbor in Unit B was a man who looked to be in his late 40s. We crossed paths in the shared entry on the second night, and he introduced himself as Glenn. He wore a navy sweatshirt even when it was warm, kept a trim beard, and spoke cautiously, like someone unaccustomed to small talk. All I learned was that he worked night shifts at Macron and preferred to keep to himself. That suited me perfectly. I was busy learning my new job and settling in. 3 nights later, on a Friday, I got back from dinner on Broadway Avenue around 10:30. I made myself tea, took off my shoes, and stepped out onto the small back deck to smell the firs. The air was still, the streetlights pooled orange light. At midnight, I lay down to check email on my phone. From beneath my feet came a faint, prolonged moan. It wasn't a word. It sounded like the end of a scream that never quite escaped. I sat up. It repeated, muffled and distant, and then stopped. I remembered Mrs. Horton's warning. Maybe Glenn was watching a horror movie through old speakers at low volume. I waited a bit longer, heard nothing else, and eventually fell asleep. The next night, almost at the same time, the wail returned. This time it sounded sharper, as if someone had tried to scream and a hand had covered their mouth halfway through the cry. It lasted 3 seconds. Then came another sound, a dull thud, and a hurried scraping. My heart sped up. I muted my phone and stayed still, counting my heartbeats. Boise was supposed to be quiet, but what came from the subfloor sounded like fear. I kept telling myself it had to be Glenn's TV. People sometimes put on strange things to relax. Even so, the way the scream cut off knotted my stomach. I slid out of bed, walked to the breaker box in the entry closet, and flipped the switch that powered my router's outlet. No internet. Any streaming on Glenn's side ought to die too. The basement fell immediately silent. No music, no dialogue, no canned laughter. Only then did I notice how loud my breathing was. On Sunday, I saw Glenn locking his truck. I tried to bring up what I'd heard. He rubbed the back of his neck, looked at the sky instead of at me, and said it was probably his TV. "Old speakers distort the sound," he added. His tone was calm, but he never met my eyes. I wanted to press him, but I barely knew him and didn't want trouble in my first month. I nodded and walked to my car, pretending I believed him. During the week, I focused on work, but every night I dreaded returning to the duplex. On Tuesday at 11:45, the scream came back. This time it was followed by a low rattling, metal on metal, like a chain sliding along a pipe. I stood barefoot in the hallway, forced to admit that no thriller repeats the same single cry, at the same hour, 3 nights in a row. I opened my voice memo app, hit record, and waited. The sound repeated twice, each one accompanied by that metallic dragging. When the calm returned, I stopped the file and played it back. Even through the phone's tiny speaker, the noise raised my hackles. It sounded human, unmistakably alive, and terrified. The next morning, I emailed the clip to myself from my desk. I searched local news sites for missing persons in Boise, but found nothing that fit. That night, I left my phone on the floor beside the vent and recorded an hour of raw audio. The screams came again at 12:10 and 12:17. Each was shorter than the last, ending in a sob. I decided the time for courtesy was over. If Glenn truly had a woman down there, every hour mattered. On Thursday, I left the office at 5 and drove straight to the Boise City Police Station on Barrister Drive. Inside, I asked to speak with the duty officer, introduced myself, and explained that I might be hearing someone held against their will beneath my duplex. Officer Ramirez, a patient woman in her 30s, listened to the first recording through headphones. Her face hardened as soon as the second scream played. She asked for my address, my neighbor's full name, and the basement's layout. I admitted I'd never gone down because Mrs. Horton kept the dividing door locked. Ramirez excused herself and returned 10 minutes later with Sergeant Kohler, who thanked me for the tip and said a patrol would meet me at home around 8:30. They told me to stay at a friend's place until then and not to confront Glenn. I went to a coworker's apartment off Park Center Boulevard, drank chamomile tea, and watched the clock crawl toward 8. At 8:20, my phone buzzed. The police were already there. I left immediately, skin prickling as I drove through dimly lit streets. When I arrived, 2 squad cars idled by the curb and an unmarked SUV blocked Glenn's driveway. Red and blue lights pulsed across the duplex's brick. I parked half a block away and approached Sergeant Kohler, who stood with Mrs. Horton in front of Unit B. There was no sign of Glenn. Kohler said they had knocked, but no one answered. The landlady produced the master keys, muttering that Glenn had always seemed normal. The officers pulled on gloves and switched on their body cams, went into the unit, and disappeared inside. Minutes later, they returned with grim faces. They had found Glenn in the living room, calm, saying he had been asleep. The sergeant was suspicious and asked about the basement. Glenn said something about water leaks. The officers insisted. In the farthest corner of the basement, half hidden by old moving blankets, they discovered a little room built out of plywood. Inside, a woman in her 20s lay bound at wrists and ankles, with duct tape over her mouth. She was dehydrated but conscious. Paramedics were already on their way. I watched Glenn come out in handcuffs, his face ashen and his gaze lost. He didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved. As they loaded him into the patrol car, the rescued woman sat on the ambulance's rear bumper, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her eyes kept dropping to the ground again and again, as if she still couldn't accept the open air on her skin. I learned her name was Ashley, a Boise State University student, and that she had been missing for 4 days. She had accepted a rideshare that never brought her home. Glenn's truck matched the description her friends had circulated on Instagram. The duplex was cordoned off with yellow tape. For 2 hours, investigators photographed every inch and sealed evidence in plastic bags. When they finally let me into Unit A to grab the essentials, I knew I could never sleep there again. The thin wall between units felt charged with memory. Every floorboard creaked like a warning. I packed my suitcase in silence and spent the night at an airport motel near Victory Road. The room smelled of bleach, but the walls were thick and no whales seeped through. The next morning, a detective interviewed me at headquarters. He asked about every sound, every time I saw Glenn, every change in his behavior. I mentioned the hooded sweatshirt, the nervous look, the habit of parking his truck in reverse so the plate faced the house. They wrote it all down. Before saying goodbye, the detective thanked me for trusting my instincts. He said doctors expected Ashley to recover physically. As for the emotional scars, no one could promise anything. Glenn was charged with kidnapping, assault, and possession of illegal restraint devices. On his computer, seized from Unit B, they had supposedly found searches about soundproofing basements and anesthetic drugs. I moved out that same weekend. Mrs. Horton returned my deposit without argument. The duplex stayed dark for months. Every time I drove past on my way to Albertsons, my stomach hollowed out, as if the building itself exhaled sorrow. My new apartment on Grove Street had thin windows but thick concrete slabs. Some nights I woke with a start, convinced I could hear a distant plea running through pipes, until I remembered where I was. I kept the recordings on my phone, unable to play them and at the same time reluctant to delete them. They reminded me that real terror is silent, every day, and often right beneath our feet. Friends from Missoula asked why I seemed different when I visited for Thanksgiving. I told them Boise had taught me to listen, because evil rarely screams at full volume. Sometimes it whispers between the floorboards at midnight, hoping no one notices. I noticed, but just in time. I still think about what might have happened if I had trusted Glenn's shrug and the word television. The thought won't let me go, and in a way that's fine. It keeps my ears alert every night, wherever I live. 6 months later, I testified at Glenn's preliminary hearing at the Ada County Courthouse downtown. The courtroom was cool, the lights harsh, When I described the screams, my throat tightened and the words stuck. Ashley sat behind the prosecutor, hands clasped, nails short. She met my eyes only once, a look that held more gratitude than I deserved. Glenn never turned his head. The judge ruled there was enough evidence to go to trial. Outside, local reporters crowded the steps seeking statements. I said nothing. My words were already recorded where it mattered. I'm still working at the logistics company. Some afternoons I walk the river trail, hearing cyclists glide by and geese chattering over the water. Boise felt safe again, but it's a different kind of safety, braided with responsibility. I keep the voice recorder shortcut on my phone's home screen. I pay attention when a dog growls toward a basement window or when a driver brakes too hard near a high school. Some people laugh at that level of alertness, but I have heard life pleading through wood and concrete. I know how easy it is to mistake that sound for a broken speaker or a bad dream. Every night when I slide the deadbolt, I pause one heartbeat longer than before. I remember Ashley's shoulders covered by the blanket and the mark the tape left on her cheek.